Good evening, and welcome to this evening's AC Connect. Thank you for joining us for this AC Connect session, a revised and updated provincial wage scale for early childhood educators in Alberta. In 2023, AC released its first recommendations for a provincial wage scale for early childhood educators. Since then, the early learning and childcare landscape across Canada has continued to evolve, with most provinces and territories now either having wage scales in place or committing to developing them. With support from the Muttart Foundation and a leading childcare economist, AECEA has revised and updated its draft wage scale for Alberta. Tonight's session will introduce the updated draft, explore the evidence and values that inform its development, and begin an important conversation about how a provincial wage scale could support recruitment, retention, and professionalism within Alberta's early learning and childcare sector. This is the beginning of a broader engagement process. We look forward to hearing your questions and perspectives as we continue this work together. I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that what we call Alberta is the traditional and ancestral territory of many peoples, presently subject to Treaties 6, 7, and 8, namely the Blackfoot Confederacy, Kainai, Piikani, and Siksika, the Cree, Dene, Sutu, Nakota Sioux, Stoney Nakoda, and the Tsuut'ina Nation, as well as the Otipemisiwak Métis people of Alberta. We acknowledge the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit who have lived in and cared for these lands for generations. We are grateful for the traditional knowledge keepers and elders who are still with us today and those who have gone before us. We make this acknowledgement as an act of reconciliation and gratitude to those whose territory we reside on or are visiting. We recognize the deep and enduring connection between Indigenous peoples and the earth, and we are grateful for the wisdom and resilience they have brought in stewarding these lands. As a community dedicated to early learning and childcare, we embrace our role in fostering an understanding of respect, responsibility, and connection to the land in us and our youngest citizens. We commit to learning from Indigenous perspectives on caring for the earth as we work to nurture and protect it. As early childhood educators, we are called to honor this legacy and protecting the land for generations yet to come. This evening's session will be hosted through Zoom webinars and is being recorded and will be made available on the AC website following the session. All attendees are muted during the presentation. You're welcome to use the chat to connect with others and answer questions from the speaker, but please keep questions for the presenters in the Q&A box. Both functions are found on the bottom of your screen. As part of our commitment to maintaining a high standard of shared learning and collaboration, we ask all participants and presenters to refrain from promoting their own businesses or services in the chat during the sessions. This helps keep the space inclusive and focused for everyone attending the session. We completely understand how easy it is to blur these lines in a space like this, and we truly appreciate your understanding and grace in honoring this expectation. As a reminder, AECEA is a member-based organization, and the ability to do our work is dependent on membership. If you are not already a member, you can become one by going to aece.ca/membership. And now to our presenters. Christopher Smith is an Associate Executive Director for the Muttart Foundation, a private charitable foundation based in Edmonton. He has led responsibility for the foundation's work in early childhood education and care. In support of his work at the foundation, Christopher serves on the steering committee for the Community University Partnership for the Study of Children, Youth, and Families at the University of Alberta. In fall 2022, he was appointed to the National Advisory Council on Early Learning and Childcare, which provides advice to the Federal Minister of Jobs and Families on Canada-wide early learning and childcare system building. Also, we have Kirsten Morley, who is a program officer with the Muttart Foundation, supporting the foundation's work in early learning and childcare. Previously, she was a senior policy analyst with the Government of Alberta, working on childcare policy. She also spent over 6 years working with the Community University Partnership for the study of children, youth, and families at the University of Alberta, where she had the privilege of working with community-based organizations on research projects related to child development and poverty reduction. And finally, we also have Mary Frances Smith, who is the Executive Director of the Association of Early Childhood Educators of Alberta, AECEA, and has more than 35 years of experience in early learning and childcare across a variety of settings, including out-of-school care, Head Start, ECS, and Indigenous communities. She holds a Bachelor of Education in Special Education and a Master's of Arts in Community Engagement. Her career has included leadership roles within Alberta Childcare Accreditation Program, where she co-authored the Out-of-School Care Standards and Aligned Standards, and served as Accreditation Manager. Her graduate research focused on workforce stability and educator support in Alberta early learning and childcare sector, including leading the development of the Alberta compensation framework, the ECE wage grid recommendations. And Mary Frances, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Catherine, and thank you, Laura, for being in the background and helping us with tech support. And thank you, everybody, for being here tonight. I know it's been kind of hard to sit down and focus with all this rain and everything, so thank you all for being here. In 2023, the Association of Early Childhood Educators of Alberta released its first recommendation for a wage scale report. That work is grounded in research that I was involved in during my master's degree at the University of Alberta. It was part of the requirements to be involved in a community-based project. I reached out to our professional association, AECEA, to ask what was on their mind, and they all said compensation. What would a wage scale look like in Alberta? That original document, that original report that you see on the screen here, was developed in partnership with AECEA, 3 graduate students that I was working with, the Council for Early Learning and Childcare, and the Community University Partnership. It also involved informing and bringing in educator voices, operators, and it was built on the principle that compensation should reflect education, experience, professional responsibilities, and that work led to this current role that I have with AECEA as the ED. Since then, many things have changed. The policy landscape has evolved quite significantly. The revised and updated wage scale that we are being shown today reflects the new evidence that we are seeing. These reports are designed to foster dialogue among educators, operators, government, post-secondary institutions, families, and all of our community partners. We recognize that implementing a provincial wage scale will require thoughtful planning, sustainable funding, and collaboration across the sector. At the same time, we want to affirm a simple principle. A high-quality early learning and childcare sector depends on a workforce that is valued, respected, and fairly compensated. This revised wage scale is offered as a continuation of that conversation that we started 3 years ago. It's about the future of Alberta's early learning and childcare profession. By investing in people who deliver early learning and childcare every single day, we can strengthen workforce stability, improve quality and safety for children and families, and build a profession that attracts and retains talented educators for generations to come. A provincial wage scale is much more than just compensation, though. It is a statement of values. It affirms that educators are skilled professionals, that their work is valued and deserves to be recognized. At its core, a wage scale for Alberta would ensure that Alberta educators are fairly compensated for their education, their experience, and the roles that they have. that wages are comparable to other occupations and require similar qualifications and carry similar levels of responsibility. It should make career progression visible and meaningful so educators can see a career for themselves. They can experience financial rewards for their growing knowledge, leadership, and contributions over time. Ultimately, the wage scale is really about improving educators' well-being and strengthening our workforce by investing in those people who make quality possible. I'll pass it over to Kirsten.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Mary Frances, for orienting us in the values that have guided this work and that serve as the foundation really for everything that we're going to be talking about today. So many people might remember AECE's previous engagement around the wage scale. They might have been part of those conversations, or they might be hearing about what's happening in other provinces across Canada, who many of which have moved towards implementing wage scales. But for others, this might be a newer concept. And so we're going to start off by giving a quick overview of what exactly a wage scale is. So what a wage scale tries to do is to provide a transparent and predictable way to set wages. So rather than wages being set by individual employers with no certainty about when or if an educator will receive a wage increase, a wage scale tries to specify that what educators across the entire sector would be paid based on their years of experience and their certification level. So under a wage scale, for example, all educators who have a level 3 certification and 5 years of experience would be paid the same wage. A wage scale also clearly lays out when an educator's wages should be increased based on attaining additional years of experience so that wages don't stagnate as they can currently. So you can see in this example image that we have here, along the top, we have what are called steps. And the steps align with years of experience or years of service. And so an entry-level educator just coming into the sector is placed at step 1. And they would move to step 2 and so on as they gain more experience in the sector. The second major factor that determines where someone is placed on the scale is their level. And so on the left-hand side of that image, you can see level. And this aligns with certification or role. So you see a level 1 would fall level 1, step 1. So where you fall on the wage scale is the function of 2 factors, your step and your level. And when we get to the actual wage scale later in the presentation, you'll be able to see the wage rates that AECE has actually assigned to these various steps and levels, but we'll keep that for later. So why are we talking about a wage scale now? The answer to this question really lies in the opportunity that's been presented by the Canada-wide early learning and childcare agreements, which have brought billions of new federal investments into childcare sectors across Canada over the past 5 years, and they've really transformed childcare into something that has been historically delivered through a private market to something that's now majority publicly funded. And with that new public funding, we have the opportunity to do things differently than we have in the past. And so prior to signing the Canada-wide Early Learning and Childcare Agreement, childcare in Alberta was predominantly a market-based service. And so this meant that most of the funding coming into the childcare system was provided by parent fees. And because providers had to keep the cost of childcare low enough so that parents could actually afford to access it, this meant that wages were also kept low. And so since educators or service providers couldn't actually raise wages above a certain level, we can't actually raise wages for educators. But today we have a very different model. So today, the provincial government is covering about 80% of the costs of childcare in this province through grants that are provided to operators. Parent fees today make up actually a minority of the funding that's coming into our childcare system. And so with this, we now have a situation where childcare is majority a publicly funded service. And with this, we have the opportunity to rethink our funding models. And if we look at other publicly funded systems, if we look at other publicly funded systems and sectors like healthcare and education, we see that they have wage scales. This is a common way of providing compensation. This is really important for government to ensure that public monies are used effectively. And it's really important to ensure that our educators who are doing extremely vital work are being compensated fairly. Also, if we look across Canada at what's happening in other jurisdictions, other provinces and territories are moving towards wage scales. So in Alberta, along with Ontario, we're now a bit of an outlier in that we are some of the two only jurisdictions that have yet to implement or commit to implementing a wage scale. So we have this huge opportunity in front of us, and we need to continue having these conversations to really elevate the importance of the wage scale in the eyes of government and those who are able to make these really important decisions about how we compensate our educators. So in the following slides, we'll touch a bit more on what compensation in Alberta currently looks like for educators, but it's likely no surprise to many of you or all of you when we say that the early learning and childcare workforce has been under-supported in Alberta. And this is because it has existed in this market-based model where there's been these structural limitations on wages. And it's also because childcare has been predominantly delivered and carried out by women, and there is a systematic undervaluing of this kind of work. And so many of you have seen this being played out in your own centers or have had firsthand experience of this. But really unsurprisingly, low wages contribute to staff shortages, and they also contribute to turnover of educators. The rapid growth of the childcare sector since these new federal investments has also intensified these longstanding challenges with recruitment and retention. So to staff the incredible number of spaces that have been created since 2021, Alberta has had to grow its workforce enormously. So since 2021, the workforce has grown from about 18,100 educators to 34,300 educators today. And this is a 90% increase. But we know that although educators may be entering the sector, they're not necessarily staying. And so this retention is a really important piece that we need to look at. And retaining educators relies on fair compensation and a pathway for people to see a future for themselves in this career. And when educators feel supported and they are well compensated, we know that this has benefits for childcare quality. Stability is so important for our children, and educators need to be able to be sustained in their roles to provide that kind of consistency that we know is so key to childcare quality, and that creates the kind of environments that lead to positive outcomes for children's development. So we've talked about how educator wages in Alberta are low. But here we have some of the context to kind of put that into context and provide a bigger picture. So what are we really talking about? So in this chart, the first three bars in the green and the yellow are showing the average wages for early childhood educators in Alberta for level ones, level twos, and level threes. So the green at the bottom of the bar is showing the average wages set by employers, and then the yellow at the top is showing the amount of wage top-up that's provided by government. And then the values on the top of the bars is showing the wage inclusive of the wage top-up and the employer set wage. So we can see that the average wage in Alberta for a level one is about $20 an hour. For a level two is about $23 an hour. And for a level three is about $29 per hour. And if you look at the green bars, you can see that really most of the difference in wages between the certification levels is actually due to that wage top-up. So we're not seeing a huge difference between employer set wages across the three levels. And then the blue bar at the far right is showing the average provincial wage in Alberta across all industries. So this is essentially if we take the average wages, if we take the wages for all jobs and we average them. And the average wage is $37 per hour. So clearly, early childhood educators across all certification levels are falling well below that average provincial wage. Another thing we had to try to put these numbers into context is to look at the average wages for early childhood educators and compare them to the wages for occupations that require a similar level of education. So we compared level ones with jobs that require about a high school diploma, level twos with jobs that require a one-year certificate, and then level threes with jobs that require a two-year diploma. And so what we found is that when you're looking at your level ones and your level twos, their wages tend to fall in the bottom of the wages for those occupations that require a similar level of education. So they're actually falling into the bottom quartile of wages. So even when we compare those level ones and level twos against jobs requiring similar education, they're still earning less. And then a final comparison we did was with the living wage. And so the living wage is an estimation of the wage someone would need to earn in various communities across Alberta to cover their basic living expenses. And so the average wage for a level one educator is actually below the living wage in most communities across the province. And if we're looking at a community like Calgary, where we know many educators will live, the average or the living wage for 2025 is actually $26.50 per hour. And so even our level two ECEs in Calgary are earning less than a living wage. And so we know we have a really big problem if people doing some of our most vital work are not being paid enough to actually meet their basic necessities in the communities that they live in. So as we saw in the previous slide, the wage scale is a really important piece of Alberta's workforce strategy, and this is crucial for increasing wages for early childhood educators in Alberta, and it has been for years. So why isn't the wage top-up by itself enough to address our workforce challenges, and what benefits does a wage scale actually have over something like a wage top-up? So one of the primary advantages of a competitive wage scale is that it can ensure that no matter where an educator works, they are paid fairly and equitably. So it wouldn't matter which center an educator works at, the size of that center. It wouldn't matter what community they live in. Educators could be paid the same amount, across the sector. In low wage sectors like childcare, we also see that staff will often move between employers for relatively low increases. So for a level one who's earning about an average of $20 per hour, a $1 increase in wage can actually be enough to incentivize them to move to a different center. But because stability and consistency are so important in this sector, we don't want to do things that will incentivize rapid movement between centers and moving between employers. So a wage scale that ensures that no matter where a person works, they are paid the same based on their level of certification and their experience can actually reduce this kind of turnover and provide greater stability across the sector, and ideally, greater benefits for our children that we're raising. And then finally, predictable wage growth over time is another major advantage of something like a wage scale. So under a wage top-up, there is no requirement for service providers to actually ever provide a wage increase. And the last time government increased the wage top-up was in 2023. A wage scale is intended to provide regular increases over time after a certain length of service. And it provides it in a transparent way so that someone can see a long-term pathway for themselves in this sector and know what they'll make at various stages of their career. Also, if an educator were to leave a particular center or a particular program, they would continue to be paid the wage that they had. They would take that wage with them. They would take their experience with them. They wouldn't receive a wage decrease or kind of be starting over at a new center, but they would be able to take that with them and have that kind of stability. Right. And so this chart is comparing the provinces that have wage scales. So those are our bars in blue to the provinces that have wage enhancements or wage top-ups, and these are provinces like Alberta, and those are the bars in the green. And what we're looking at is the starting wage or the wage floor for an educator with a 2-year diploma, and we're comparing it to the provincial average hourly wage. And so in Alberta, we're looking at our level 3s who have that minimum 2-year diploma. And just a caution when we're looking at this table, this is not the same as the average wages that we showed in the previous slide. So for many provinces, we don't actually have public data on the average wages for their educators, but we do know the starting wage on their wage scale that an entry-level educator just entering the sector would be paid. And to come to a comparable number for a province like Alberta that still is relying on wage top-ups, we have to look at a wage floor. So essentially the minimum wage in that province plus whatever the wage top-up is. So this is certainly not a perfect comparison, but it allows us to look at how our provinces are stacking up. The main takeaway that we want to highlight from this chart is that the starting wage or the wage floor for educators is most competitive compared to the provincial average wage in those provinces that do have wage scales. So for example, if we're looking at Prince Edward Island on the left side of the chart, they have a wage scale and they have their provincial average wage, their starting wage on their wage scale is 97% of the provincial average wage in that province. And so these are essentially matching each other. And so we can say that the wage for an early childhood educator entering the sector in Prince Edward Island is very competitive compared to other wages for other jobs in that province. And we might say that in PEI, early childhood education is a good job. It's a job that provides fair compensation and potentially stability and long-term career growth. You can also see that if we look at Alberta, you can also see that if we look at Alberta, we actually tie for last with British Columbia. And so in Alberta, the wage floor for a level 3 early childhood educator is just 63% of the average provincial wage. And we care that there's a big difference between these numbers because it means that early childhood education in Alberta is perhaps not a competitive job or perhaps not what we might call a good job. But one of the really exciting things that we're hearing is that when we do have wage scales that compensate educators more competitively, we're seeing impacts in terms of better recruitment and retention. So Prince Edward Island has published an evaluation study looking at the impact of new policies like its wage scale and like its pension plan on the workforce. And they're finding that these things have really great benefits for retention and recruitment in the sector. And so from this, we can kind of see that when the wage scales are designed to be fair and competitive, they can make a really big difference to recruitment and retention for early childhood educators. And now Chris is going to speak a bit more to just how we went about trying to design the wage scale for Alberta and dive into what those numbers look like, those updated new numbers.
Great, thanks, Kirsten, and appreciate Mary Frances and Kirsten introducing the presentations. So firstly, what I'm going to talk about is the jurisdictions that have put wage scales in place. What does that process look like? Then we'll talk a little bit about the design, and then we'll get to the slide that you really want to get to, which shows what the wage scale revised and updated looks like for Alberta. So as Kirsten and Mary Frances said, it's now, if you look across the country, 8 jurisdictions now have provincial wage scales, publicly funded wage scales in place for early childhood educators. And in most cases, those scales were developed by the provincial or territorial government itself taking the lead. And so why did the governments do that? Well, they did that in response to some of the points that Kirsten and Mary Frances raised at the beginning. We're now approaching early learning childcare in a different way. We're primarily publicly funding it. We're looking at expanding the services. And as we expand the services, what we also need to do is to look at increasing the size of the workforce. So jurisdictions have shifted to wage scales to reflect the need to make compensation competitive and fair. Now, in most of the jurisdictions that have implemented those wage scales, so there's 8 in place, those wage scales were developed by the provincial or territorial government, generally without a lot of consultation with the field itself. So essentially, it was the level of government deciding what was a competitive and fair wage scale. So I think that's something that we might want to reflect on, because that means that the government really is determining the competitive and fairness of the wages. Now, 2 of those jurisdictions, PEI and Quebec, had wage scales prior to Canada-wide, but essentially most of them were brought in after Canada-wide. And if you look at the second bullet, what we've commented on here is that ideally, when you look at developing a wage scale, a competitive and fair wage scale for educators within a province, educators and the professional associations that represent them should be part of those conversations, because that's where we can bring in the values that Mary Frances spoke to. So ideally, it's not the government that develops the wage scale on its own. It's the government that develops the wage scale in consultation with the field. And if you look at the final bullet, what we now see is early learning and childcare sectors in Canada, with the exception of Quebec, are the only remaining publicly funded sectors. So the primary funding for the services is public, where governments and employers set out wages without some form of collective bargaining. So if you think of a publicly funded sector, think of education, think of healthcare and all the professions in those 2 fields, the wages for the staff in education and in health are determined through a competitive bargaining process between the field and the government to determine wages. And obviously, they sometimes disagree on what those competitive wages are, but it's part of a public collective process. So if I can get the next slide, please, Mary Frances. Sorry, Laura. So the design process. So how do jurisdictions go about designing what looks like a competitive and fair wage scale? So essentially, there's 2 or 3 different approaches you can use. If you look at the middle bullet, what you'll see is that there's something called a comparator approach, which Kirsten referenced when she introduced the topic. And there's also a provincial average wage approach. So what you try to do, if you're trying to set a competitive and fair wage scale, what you have to do is you have to make comparisons. And so in a number of cases, so if you look at the 4 provinces at the top, BC, Ontario, Saskatchewan, Alberta, in those particular provinces now, there are processes going on with the associations playing a leadership role, trying to determine what is a fair and competitive wage scale. And the 2 approaches they're using is what's called a comparator approach or a provincial average wage approach. Now, in AECEA's particular wage scale, they looked at the benefits of one or the other. And what AECEA decided to do, as Kirsten referenced, they decided to develop the wage scale based on a comparator approach. So what does that mean? That means for level 1, level 2, level 3 educators, and for staff in senior roles, administration and management, what we did is compare the wages in comparable occupations, so comparable occupations that have a similar level of education, similar roles and responsibilities, similar skills, if you like, and say, what should be a comparator wage? So in essence, how do we make sure that early learning and childcare workers are paid in a way that's competitive? And so what you can do, you can compare to related fields. So in education, you might compare to educational assistants, for instance. And then in health fields, you compare to professions like a licensed practical nurse. And so you're looking for making the field competitive. As Kirsten said, how do you make early learning and childcare a good job? How do you do that? Well, you make the wages competitive. And so what you also might want to look at is you might want to look at the fields in which educators leave to go to. Where would educators leave to go to in terms of more competitive compensation? But where might they also not look at early childhood education? So if you look at students who are looking at their post-secondary education, when students are looking at a credential, what they're also looking at is what does the career, the job, and the compensation look like after I graduate? So this is a competitive wage scale based on comparator occupations, similar levels of education, similar roles and responsibilities, similar skills, and saying, how do we make sure early child educators compare favorably to other occupations? So if I can get the next slide, please, Laura. And just a note, what this wage scale doesn't do at this point, and this is further work that's required, what the wage scale that you're going to see next, I promise it's coming up, what the wage scale doesn't do is it doesn't actually comment at the moment on the compensation for family childcare educators. Now, I know there's some family childcare educators on the call, but when we met with some groups to talk through this, what it was discussed is that there's some significant differences in the work of family childcare educators and the way they're compensated that makes this wage scale not a good fit for them. So this wage scale is based on the premise that you're working in a center-based childcare. It's based on the premise that you are an employee rather than a self-employed contractor. And so it doesn't fit family childcare educators at the moment. So what we need to do is AECE needs to work with the Alberta Family Childcare Association, the licensed family day homes, and we need to determine what is a competitive and fair compensation package for family childcare educators. That's work that still needs to be continued. So if I can get the next slide, please. And somebody's put some questions about competitive bargaining process, comparative approach, how do you make wages competitive? So some questions. I don't know if you want us to ask those. We'll try and come back to those at the end. So this is the slide probably everybody's going to focus on. So when Kirsten talked about the composition of a wage scale, what she talked about was steps and levels. So what you can see here on this grid, this revised, updated draft grid, is you'll see along the top, you'll see steps. And the steps relate to numbers of years of experience in the field. And then down the left-hand side in the purple, what you will see is level. So if you think, let's look at the left-hand side first. So what we've got is level 1, 2, and 3. And these are direct service frontline staff, if you like. And then you've got leadership positions, supervisor, director. So that's the kind of level, because it's essentially the role and responsibility that in most cases align with level of certification. So level, then across the top, what you see is a series of steps. So the steps relate to your number of years of experience in the field. So when you start out at step 1, and then you progress through to step 7. Now, the steps, are they based on 1 year? Are they based on 2 years? That's to be determined. The difference between the steps is 3%, and that's based on an average of Alberta's rate of inflation over the last 25 years. So, as Kirsten said earlier, when you start out with a starting wage linked to your level, which links to your certification, roles and responsibilities. And then as educators progress through the field in terms of number of years of experience, their compensation increases on a stepped basis. Now, over time, what we would also expect is that the whole wage scale itself would be constantly updated and refreshed to reflect the rising cost of living. But essentially, this is what the scale looks like. And I'm just going to draw your attention to the step 4. It's the bolded numbers. And so what step 4 does, so that's the midpoint of the scale, the midpoint of the grid, if you like, what that essentially relates to is what we might think of as an average wage, right? So if educators had a career in the field, that would be the average point, the midpoint of the grid. And so if you look at the average wages on this scale that's been developed through comparisons with related occupations, and when you look at I encourage you to look at the final report, what you'll see at the back as the appendices are the different occupations that comparisons were made to. So when you look at that midpoint, if you look at the midpoint for a level 3 with a diploma, anyone remember what the provincial average wage was? $37.35. So the average wage for a level 3 educator with a diploma at $35 is about 95% of the provincial average wage. So essentially, what we might be able to argue now is if this is the wage scale that we're looking at working towards, that average wage for a level 3 is a competitive wage, which is a far cry from what it is now. Again, and then if you look at the bottom, when you look at the leadership positions, those leadership, supervisor, director roles, the average wage for those individuals in leadership positions will exceed the provincial average wage. So essentially, a supervisory manager position, now that's earning above the average wage. And if you look again, Kirsten had referenced the living wage. If you look at level 1 now, the midpoint is the living wage across the province. So essentially what we're trying to do, and it was done through a technical exercise, based on comparisons with related occupations, we're trying to ensure that the field of early learning and childcare education is a competitive field. And we're also trying to ensure that it's a fair field. So I can get the next slide, please, Laura. So what does it look like in terms of the changes? So if you look on this particular table, what you'll see is the average Alberta wage with top-up. That's the current average wage. And then you'll see the draft wage scale at the midpoint of the new grid. And then what you see is the change. So essentially, other than level 1, what we're seeing is increases of around 25% and up. And unfortunately, we weren't able to do any comparisons with the senior leadership positions because currently Alberta doesn't provide any data on those leadership positions. So essentially, it's an uplift of average wages for educators across the province at somewhere around 20 to 25%. And the funny thing is that 25% increase aligns with what the YMCA previously arrived at in its sort of national research on how do we make early learning and childcare a competitive field. So it's basically said that to make early learning and childcare a competitive field, what we're looking at, we need to increase the wages by around 25%. So this grid actually does that based on that comparison model. So again, comparative occupations compared to early childhood educators, similar levels of education, skills, and responsibilities result in a significant uplift. And to go back to something that Kirsten said at the beginning, because I think it's very important to consider, is that why are early child educators underpaid? And yes, it's because we relied primarily on a market-based system where parent fees were the primary source of revenue to support wages. But it's because of what Kirsten remarked on is early learning and childcare, it's a primarily dominated female workforce. And unfortunately, caring economy female workforces tend to be underpaid. So this grid as proposed will make this a competitive field. So if I can get the next slide, please, Laura. And what are some of the things that we also need to take into consideration as we think about the grid? So the first thing we need to recognize is we don't actually know what the range of wages are for early child educators working in the field at the moment. We know what the average is. We know what the minimum is, but we don't know what the full range is. So if we are going to move to introduce a grid, it's correct to grandfather educators in who are at higher wage scale. So those educators who are at a higher level than they would be on that grid in terms of level and number of steps will continue to receive that higher compensation. So it's not an attempt to try to bring wages down, it's an attempt to try to lift wages up across the field. So we need to do that. The second thing we'll need to do is we probably need to look at regional adjustments. What does that mean? Well, that means across the province, when we look at labor markets, so if we're taking a hard economic standpoint and we're looking at labor markets, we need to make early learning and childcare competitive. And when we look at different labor markets across the province, what we see is two sets of factors that make a labor market a tighter market, a more difficult market to work in. And one of them is the cost of living in the community. So if you think of communities like Canmore, Banff, and Jasper, very expensive communities, that's a cost of living premium. But we also have labor markets where there's a shortage of staff. Fort McMurray, some of the northern communities. So what we think is within the wage scale, although we have a particular wage scale for the whole province, what we're probably going to have to look at is some regional adjustments to reflect either cost of living increases in certain communities or more likely labor market shortages. So there will need to be some regional adjustments. What we also need to recognize is that within the current wage scale, what we've not talked about is the non-wage benefits. So if we're looking at recruiting and retaining high qualified professional staff, not only do we have to look at the compensation that they receive, but we also have to look at the non-wage benefits, the workplace benefits that they receive. So for instance, if you think of an educator with a level 2 leaving early child education to go into the educational system to be an educational assistant, the wages wouldn't change that much, but what would change is the non-wage benefits. So we also have to think about how do we also address over time the non-wage benefits, so access to health insurance, access to pension plans, access to disability insurance. That also needs to be taken into consideration. It's a very important consideration. Again, 3 dimensions in terms of a quality early learning and childcare workforce, compensation, benefits, and working conditions. So if I can get the next slide, please. So how do we implement this wage scale? And I think it's really clear, we need to be very clear starting out with that this wage scale, what you're seeing is a draft wage scale. It's a draft wage scale that sets out compensation based on a standard approach called a comparison approach. And it's a wage scale that looks similar in terms of structure and design to the wage scales across the country. So this is not an outlier. I think Robert just said, are we attempting to mirror PEI? No, we're not attempting to mirror PEI, Robert. We're attempting to comparative approach that actually does come pretty close to PEI. PEI used the provincial average wage. So this wage scale looks similar to the wage scales that are in place in other jurisdictions. And what it now needs, firstly, it needs to be reviewed and considered by educators and service providers and said, does this look like it's equitable and fair? Does it make sense? So educators and service providers need to look at this wage scale and say, does it work in essence? Does this provide competitive and fair wages? So that's a very first important step. And I think AECEA is going to talk about how they might do that. Well, we also need to recognize that if we are moving to this wage scale model, if we're moving to the same kind of approach for compensation that is in place in the majority of jurisdictions, that's going to mean changes to how Alberta currently funds and supports the delivery of services. So if you think of the supply side funding that's coming in, that supply side funding would have to be changed to reflect this particular wage scale. And what it would have to be changed to, it would have to reflect that staffing costs are the major cost of delivery of services. And it would have to reflect that the money transferred to the service providers to deliver services would need to reflect the actual costs of service delivery. So there's no point having a wage scale if the implementation of it means service providers say, well, I have to get rid of my level 3s and bring in more level 1s because that will make me financially viable. So essentially, the funding model, and this is the funding model they have in place in PEI and the funding model they started to introduce in Ontario, the funding model tries to reflect the actual costs of delivering services and a portion funding on that basis. So this is a wage scale that requires a new way of thinking about financing and delivering early learning and childcare. So, and then finally, what we're saying is because this is a big change, it would result in an annual increase of around 20 to 25% in terms of the costs of staffing. This means we're probably going to have to look at a phased approach. This is not something that we're going to introduce next year, so it's going to have to be introduced over time. And what I would say is at the moment, I think it's fair to say the minister's been silent on the wage scale at the moment. but I don't sense at this point that there's a very significant level of enthusiasm for moving towards a provincially funded wage scale. What I would argue, though, is that this is the direction that most jurisdictions are going in. And as Kirsten and Mary Frances said, if you want to make early learning and childcare a competitive field, if you want to make it a fair field, if you want to make it a good job, then you do that is improving the compensation. And the wonderful outcome that we get is that the higher the quality of the early child educator who's working in a service center, the higher the quality of the early child education the child receives. So we can look at it from the standpoint of economics. If you want to make it attractive, if you want to recruit the best staff, you need to improve the wages. And if also we look at it from the standpoint of service delivery for children and families, then we need a high quality, well-paid workforce. So I'm just going to turn it over to the final slide, and I think I'm going to turn it over to Mary Frances to talk about next steps. So thank you.
Thank you, Christopher and Kirsten. You did a great job of explaining all the background to all of this, and he just really reinforced how important it is to continue this conversation about fair compensation, equitable compensation, and the additional considerations of total compensation. That it's a bigger package within a workforce strategy. Working conditions are other pieces of it, qualifications, all those things. But having a conversation about the wage scale is really important in terms of retention, safety, and quality. So the next steps that we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking this out on the road. So starting in the fall, we're going to be taking it onto the road and bringing it to the educators to have conversations with them. How does this land for you? What are you seeing in this? Would this work for you? And getting your feedback on some of the concepts within it. So watch for that coming in the coming months. And I don't know if we want to dig into some questions right now. Christopher and Christian, if there's anything else you wanted to add?
Oh, I'm happy to try to respond to comments and questions. And again, just to reiterate a couple of things, this wage scale, this isn't an outlier. Okay. When Kirsten showed you the charts with the blue bars on the left and the green columns right, this is not an outlier. This is a wage scale that is credible and is alive in other jurisdictions. So it's not an outlier. And then somebody had, I think, posed a comment about why is the GOA silent, Robert? So I think what I would argue on that, Robert, there's two dimensions to it, I think. So again, if you look across those Canada-wide agreements, there are two jurisdictions within their initial Canada-wide agreements which did not commit to introduce a wage scale. And those two jurisdictions are Alberta and Ontario. So I think that's one reason, Robert, when they signed on to Canada-wide, they didn't commit to this. So they haven't moved on that position. And I think the second reason is, and I'll be quite honest, it's a cost reason. To introduce a wage scale will increase the cost of delivering the service. So they did not make the commitment in 2021 when the other jurisdictions did. And now they're obviously looking at the cost of the increase. But what I would say, and again, Mary Frances and Kirsten talked about this very well. What do we want early child education care to do in Alberta? What do we want early child education care to do in Alberta for the children and families? What do we want it to do? If we wanted to support their learning and development, if we wanted to provide safe, high quality early learning childcare experiences for all children and families, then we have to compensate educators in ways that allow us to recruit and retain high qualified staff. So I think at the moment, Robert, Alberta and Ontario are slightly out of phase, but this is a live discussion. This is part of the public policy debate that we have to have. So thanks for the question.
We do have a couple that were submitted with the Q&A. So we will start with one, and I apologize if I butcher this name by accident. Eka Mulieris, apologies. I wonder if and when this wage scale is accepted and implemented, what is to ensure that employers follow the wage scale? This is because even now, level 3 ECEs, with some employers are in less than average. That is how an average works, where sometimes you have below or sometimes you have above.
Yeah. There is a simple answer to that, and this is how it works in other jurisdictions that have wage scales. To receive the supply side funding, you have to commit to pay the wage scale rates. So the wage scale, it's the same if you're thinking teaching and healthcare. The compensation is determined at the provincial level, and then the funding flows to support that. So if you aren't going to compensate your educators in ways that match this provincial wage scale, you don't get the supply side funding. So it's that larger relationship between the public funder and the service provider, which says to the service provider, you are now providing a publicly funded service. So there are conditions that you have to meet that requirement. And then obviously absolutely critical that the supply side funding that is given to the provider allows them to meet the wage scale costs, right? So it's that new way of thinking about publicly funded services. You would not have an educator, say, who walked into a school in Edmonton and the principal said, yeah, I want to hire you, but I'm not going to pay you at the average or the required wage for an educator. It wouldn't even be a conversation. Similar with anyone in the health field, right? You would not have an LPN that was hired where the collective agreement about what the salary should be was then discounted. Now, you might have that in a private school, but you would not have that in publicly funded systems. So it's that different way of thinking about what is the nature of this service. So,
Thank you, Christopher. And another one from Jennifer Winters. Just asking around how job performance could be considered in this, where many educators may have worked with educators that have several years of experience, but their job performance is not up to snuff, essentially. Is there a way to address that within a wage scale?
well, this was a very interesting discussion, Jennifer, and I appreciate you raising this. So when Mary Frances and her team are out in the field in the fall, I think this is the question that comes back because there was a working group that looked at this scale that was drawn from AECEA's policy committees, public policy committee, and the discussion was, should an educator progress through the steps if they're not meeting competence or performance requirements? And I think this is where then now you end up with a discussion now of what do collective agreements look like? What does progression through scales look like? So I think, Jennifer, I would say at this point, that is an area of important discussion. How is individual performance or non-performance competence reflected in progression through the grid? And I think that's one of the live things we need to talk about. There are some advantages of saying, no, you progress through on years of experience. There are also some advantages of saying, I'm sorry, you did not meet from a performance basis the standards that required. So I think that's one of the very important things that the field is going to have to discuss, and they're going to have to resolve that. So.
Thank you. And another one from Elizabeth Granger. Just wondering about challenging ELCC courses versus taking them, and then from people coming in from other countries with their education from other countries and stuff. How is that looked at within a wage scale? Is it done by like you equate the education and the way through, similar way as how it may be done right now between level 1, 2, and 3? Or what would that look like?
Okay, I'll take a stab then turn it over to Mary Frances and Kirsten. So as Kirsten talked about, when you saw the levels were linked to certification. So certification is the initial frame of reference, if you like. What level are you certified at in terms of your level 1, 2, and 3? So that's the easiest answer. So then I'll let Kirsten and Mary Frances give the better answers if they have any inclination to do so.
It's just me and Kirsten looking at each other to see who's going to go first. The certification, I think, in its current state would probably remain with the government. So challenging the ELCC course would remain their jurisdiction within this. But you did see that within the scale, there was level 2, level 3 pure diploma, for lack of a better word, and then equivalency. And so there is some things that we can do to play around with those equivalencies. Again, those are conversations that we can have when we bring this out into the sector. Kirsten, do you have anything else you want to add?
No, nothing to add. I think that's great.
And I think Robert's put the $64,000 question in the chat, Robert, in your opinion, I'll read Robert's question. In your opinion, might this new direction open the door to unionized workers? And I think that's the question for the field. That's the question for the field, whether that collective bargaining takes place through what we might think of as unionized, organized labor, or whether that professional bargaining takes place through professional associations. What it does do, Robert, absolutely correct to identify this. What it does do, though, it opens the door for some sort of collective process. And I think the collective process is important in terms of the equity that Kirsten described. So at the moment, and I think some of you have been posting this, and I think probably some of you have been in focus groups with me before, and you have shared with me the inequities that you currently see in the field. The inequities in compensation, the inequities in access to benefits, and the inequities in working conditions. So individual educators are trying to wrestle for themselves a sense of equity. And so within a larger collective process, what we try to do is make things more equitable. We don't say to an educator, it's up to you to go into the office of your employer and negotiate your competitive wage. You are entitled to some sort of collective process. Then why is that important? Well, because it values you as a professional. It values you as a qualified educator. So I think this is the shift, and this is something the field needs to talk about. This is something the field needs to feel comfortable with. That collective process of determining what is the fair, equitable, competitive compensation for educators. And I think as Kirsten showed you on those charts, we can debate the merits of unionization, and the field should. We can debate the merits of professional associations playing leadership. But generally, across the field, if you think about it in a very simple terms, wage scales do probably increase the compensation, and they probably do introduce a greater sense of equity. And it's like everything else. You will give something up. So somebody at the moment who's got the grade A employer, and I'm sure some of you on this are those amazing employers who pay your staff right at the top of the scale. I'm sure your employees may say, I'm not as concerned or as interested in a scale. So this is that larger collective. And I think for me, who cares about me? But for me, it's what is the value that we as a community, a society, put on early learning childcare. And I think that is the notion of a publicly funded services. We have to value this field in terms of compensation. And I think it's probably going to be more of a collective process. But again, great question, Robert. And I hope when Mary Frances and her team are out, that's one of the discussions that you have about how does that collective process take shape? What does it look like? What does it need to ensure? At the end of the day, what does it need to ensure the highest quality education for children and families and the highest competitive fair wage for early child educators? It's that kind of balance that we're trying to strike. So.
Is there any difference in how Alberta's use of the federal grant dollars really differs from the other provinces as far as how it's allocated to early childhood educators?
In essence, so when you saw the initial Canada-wide agreements, so the 2021 through to 2025 agreements, that initial 5-year agreement, 25-26, in most of the agreements, and this is no surprise to you, you know this, in most of those agreements, the bulk of the federal funding went to reducing parent fees. So in Alberta's first 5-year agreement, around 70% of the federal funding went to reduce parent fees. It's expensive to reduce parent fees. Now, it was more expensive to reduce parent fees in Alberta than it was in Saskatchewan, in Manitoba, and in some other provinces. So there is some differences, Laura, but within each of the agreements, the majority of federal funds were not allocated to the workforce to improve compensation. But then what you then look at individual jurisdictions and said, well, what did they do? What did the individual provinces and territories do in terms of their funding? So Alberta has significantly increased its funding over the 5 years, which it deserves huge credit for, an additional $600 million. But some provinces have done even better. So in BC, for instance, BC's funding, provincial funding is now over $1 billion. If you look at the maritime provinces, which is kind of interesting, the maritime provinces are generally the ones that have made most progress in increasing wages and also introducing benefits. And most of those provisions, particularly around benefits, have been provincially funded. So Laura, overall, no surprise, the bulk of the funding went to reducing fees. That's true across Canada, but individual jurisdictions put more of their own investments in to support improvements in staffing. Alberta's done something, but I think there's still some room to move, certainly in terms of compensation. And as Kirsten reflected, the last wage enhancement increase was in 2023, and it wasn't a kind of knock it out of the ballpark increase, if I remember correctly. So Alberta has fallen behind, and I think what I would argue is, by comparison to provincial wages, Alberta's probably falling a little bit behind in terms of the competitiveness of the field. So.
Thank you so much. And I think we've reached the end of our session here. So thank you for everything, Christopher, Kirsten, Mary Frances. That was great. I'm going to drop AC's email in the chat here. And if you have any questions that were not answered, feel free to send them our way and we'll try to get to them when we can. The recording of this session will be available on the ACE website by late tomorrow. So you will be able to see that on there as well. And I hope everybody has a great night.